The valet's white gloves gleamed under the crystal chandeliers as he opened the door of our Mercedes S-Class. I watched expensive cars arrive one after another. Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, even a Bugatti that probably cost more than most people's houses. This was the Rothschild estate, 40,000 square feet of marble imported from Italy, artwork worth hundreds of millions, and a guest list that read like a Forbes billionaire ranking. I stepped out of the car wearing a simple navy dress from Nordstrom that cost $350. It was modest, unremarkable, the kind of dress that would help me blend into the background, which was exactly what my husband wanted. David Bennett, my husband of 5 years, adjusted his $8,000 Tom Ford suit as he walked around the car to meet me. He was 45 years old, handsome in that distinguished way that came with power and money. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled. His shoes were Italian leather that clicked against the cobblestone driveway with each confident step, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the light as he reached for my arm. But it wasn't a gentle touch. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, tight enough to leave marks I would find later, and he pulled me close. His cologne was expensive, something woody and masculine that probably cost $500 an ounce, but in that moment it made me feel sick. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice low enough that the valets couldn't hear. "These people are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of them are billionaires. They're sophisticated, educated, powerful. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I nodded, but he continued anyway. "Don't talk about your little teaching job. Don't mention that we met when you were tutoring Marcus. Don't bring up your family or where you grew up. And for God's sake, Maya, don't embarrass me like you did at the charity gala last month." The charity gala. I would never forget that night. I had worn a beautiful vintage Chanel dress that had belonged to my grandmother. It was elegant, timeless, worth more than people realized. But Sienna Rothschild, our host's daughter and my husband's mistress, though David didn't know I knew about that, had taken one look at me and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, Maya, is that from a thrift store? How resourceful." The room had laughed, and David, my husband, the man who had promised to love and protect me, hadn't defended me. Instead, he had leaned over during dinner and whispered, "Next time, let me approve what you wear before we go out." Now, standing in front of the Rothschild estate, David released my wrist and smoothed down his jacket. "Just smile, don't say much, and try not to draw attention to yourself. Can you do that for me?" His tone was the same one he might use with a child or a particularly slow employee. I looked up at him, this man I had married 5 years ago, this man who had once made me feel like the most important person in the world, and I felt nothing but a cold, calm certainty about what was going to happen tonight. "Don't worry, David," I said softly, adjusting the simple pearl necklace at my throat. "I won't embarrass you." He didn't catch the slight smile that crossed my face as I said it. He never noticed the details when it came to me anymore. I pulled my phone from my clutch and glanced at the screen. There was a text message waiting. "Everything is ready. They're all waiting." I deleted it quickly before David could see, then smoothed down my dress and followed my husband toward the entrance of the estate where our entire lives were about to change forever. But to understand what was about to happen, to really understand the magnitude of this evening, I need to take you back. Back to 6 hours earlier, back to the morning of this dinner, back to the moment when I realized that tonight would be the night when everything I had planned for the past 18 months would finally come to fruition. That morning, I had been in our kitchen making coffee. Our house was beautiful, I had to admit that. David had excellent taste when it came to real estate and interior design. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, custom Italian marble countertops, appliances that cost more than cars. It was the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines, cold and perfect and impressive. I was standing at the espresso machine, still in my pajamas, when I heard David's voice from his home office down the hall. He was on the phone and he wasn't being quiet about it. "Tonight, darling," he was saying, his voice warm in a way it never was when he spoke to me anymore. "Tonight your father is making the announcement, and then I'll finally be free. Free of this burden I've been carrying." I moved closer to the office door, my heart pounding even though I already knew who he was talking to. I had known about Sienna for over a year now, I know. I'm tired of pretending too. But we have to be patient just a little longer. After tonight, after I file the divorce papers next week, we can finally be together properly. And don't worry about the money. I've made sure Maya won't get anything substantial. She has no idea what's coming. I stood outside that door, listening to my husband plan my destruction, and I felt something that surprised me. Not pain, not anymore. I had processed that pain over the past 18 months. What I felt was satisfaction, because David had no idea what was actually coming. He thought he was the chess master, moving pieces around the board, planning his brilliant strategy. He didn't realize he was just a pawn in a much larger game. A game I had been playing since the day I discovered his affair. A game I was about to win. I walked back to the kitchen, made my coffee, and sat down at our breakfast table like nothing had happened. When David emerged from his office 10 minutes later, he barely looked at me. "I have that dinner tonight at the Rothschild estate," he said, scrolling through his phone. "You'll need to be ready by 6. And Maya, wear something simple. You don't have the taste for these kinds of events." He didn't wait for my response, just grabbed his keys and left for the office. The door closed behind him, and I sat there in that beautiful, empty house and smiled. After David left, I went upstairs to our bedroom. Our walk-in closet was the size of most people's bedrooms, but my section had been recently reorganized. 3 months ago, David had hired someone to go through my clothes while I was visiting a friend. When I came home, most of my wardrobe was gone. "I had your things updated," he had explained. "Some of what you were wearing was embarrassing. I can't have my wife looking like she shops at Target." The clothes that remained were all simple, modest, the kind of things that would help me fade into the background at events like tonight's dinner. I pulled out the navy dress I would wear tonight and found a note pinned inside from David's assistant, Jennifer. "Mr. Bennett requests you stay under a $500 budget for tonight's attire. We can't have a repeat of last month. Last month, the charity gala, the vintage Chanel dress that Sienna had mocked, the laughter, David's embarrassment, not for me, but because of me." I crumpled the note and threw it away, then hung the dress on the door and stared at it for a long moment. My phone buzzed. A text message from Catherine, David's first wife. "Are you ready for tonight?" it said. I typed back quickly, "More than ready. Is Marcus confirmed?" Her response came immediately, "He'll be there. Harrison personally invited him. David doesn't know yet." I smiled. Marcus was David's 16-year-old son from his first marriage, and he was one of the reasons I was doing all of this. Marcus, who called me mom even though I wasn't his biological mother. Marcus, who had watched his father treat me the same way David had treated Catherine. Marcus, who had come to me 6 months ago and said, "I want to help you take him down. I need to tell you how David and I met, because it's important to understand just how calculated his pursuit of me was, and how spectacularly he had underestimated who I really was." 5 years ago, I was 27 years old and working 3 jobs. During the day, I taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in a low-income neighborhood. In the evenings, I tutored wealthy kids whose parents paid me $100 an hour to help them with homework. And on weekends, I worked at my friend's catering company, serving at the same kinds of parties I would later attend as a guest. I was exhausted all the time, living in a tiny studio apartment, eating ramen more often than I wanted to admit, but I was also happy. I loved teaching. I loved seeing kids learn and grow. I loved making a difference, even if it was one student at a time. One of my tutoring clients was Marcus Bennett. He was 11 years old, brilliant but struggling in school because his parents were going through a bitter divorce. His mother, Catherine, had hired me to help him keep his grades up during the chaos. I would go to their house 3 times a week, and Marcus and I would work through his homework together. He was a sweet kid, sensitive and smart, and we bonded quickly. Catherine was kind to me, always making sure I was comfortable, always asking about my life with genuine interest. It was Catherine who warned me, actually, before anything even happened with David. "Be careful around my ex-husband," she had said to me one afternoon while Marcus was in the bathroom. "He's charming, intelligent, successful, but he sees people as tools." Once you're no longer useful to him, you become furniture. Just something in the background that he has to deal with. I had nodded politely, not really understanding what she meant. I hadn't even met David yet. That would come 2 weeks later when he showed up at Catherine's house to pick up Marcus for his custody weekend. David Bennett walked into that house like he owned it, even though it was Catherine's home from the divorce settlement. He was tall, confident, wearing an expensive suit even on a Saturday afternoon. His presence filled the room in a way that was both impressive and slightly overwhelming. When Catherine introduced us, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Maya," he said, shaking my hand and holding it just a moment longer than necessary. "Catherine tells me you're the reason Marcus's grades have improved so dramatically." "That's impressive." We talked for maybe 10 minutes while Marcus got his things ready. David asked me about my teaching, about my education, about my goals. He seemed genuinely interested, leaning forward when I spoke, maintaining eye contact, asking follow-up questions. When he left with Marcus, Catherine looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "He likes you," she said. "I can tell. That's how it started with me too. He makes you feel like you're the only person in the world who matters. Until you're not." I should have listened to her. I should have seen the red flags. But I was 27, working 3 jobs, living in a studio apartment, and a handsome, successful, sophisticated man had just looked at me like I was fascinating. When David called me 3 days later and asked me to have coffee with him, I said yes. When that coffee turned into dinner, I said yes. When he showed up at my apartment with flowers, with my favorite books, with tickets to shows I had mentioned wanting to see, I said yes. He was attentive, generous, romantic in a way that felt like something out of a movie. Within 2 months, we were dating seriously. Within 4 months, he was talking about marriage. Within 6 months, he proposed with a ring that cost more than I made in a year. "I know this is fast," he had said, down on one knee in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city. "But when you know, you're everything I've been looking for, Maya. Smart, kind, genuine. You make me want to be a better man." I said yes, of course I said yes. I was in love. Or at least I was in love with who I thought he was. We got married in a small ceremony 8 months after we met. Catherine didn't come to the wedding, but she sent a card. Inside, it said only, "I hope I'm wrong about him. For your sake." I didn't understand what she meant then. I would understand later. The first year of our marriage was good. David was attentive and affectionate. He paid off my student loans, insisted I quit my extra jobs and just focus on teaching. "My wife doesn't need to work 3 jobs, he said. "I can take care of us." He bought us a beautiful house, took me on vacations to places I had only dreamed of visiting, introduced me to a world of wealth and privilege I had never experienced. I felt like Cinderella, like I had won some kind of lottery. But slowly, subtly, things began to change. It started in the 2nd year. Small corrections at first. "Honey, maybe don't tell that story at dinner. These people won't understand your background." Or, "Let me handle the conversation with my business associates. The tech industry is complicated." Or my personal favorite, "I think you should update your wardrobe. Some of what you're wearing is a little too casual for my position." Each comment was delivered with a smile, framed as helpful advice from a husband who just wanted the best for his wife. But each comment made me feel a little smaller, a little less capable, a little more like I needed to change who I was to be worthy of being David Bennett's wife. By the 3rd year, the corrections had become constant. David criticized everything. My clothes, my hair, my makeup, my conversation topics, my friends, my family. "Your mother's accent is so strong," he said after she visited. "Maybe she shouldn't come to company events." When I defended her, he sighed like I was being difficult. "I'm not saying she's a bad person, Maya. I'm just saying she doesn't fit in with my colleagues." Is that really so hard to understand? I started avoiding my family to keep the peace. Started dressing differently, talking differently, becoming someone I didn't recognize when I looked in the mirror. The 4th year was when I discovered the affair. I had suspected something was wrong. David was working later and later, traveling more frequently, always on his phone with messages he wouldn't let me see. He had stopped touching me, stopped looking at me with anything resembling desire or interest. We lived in the same house, but we were strangers. One night, I did something I had never done before. I looked through his phone while he was in the shower. What I found destroyed me. Months of messages with Sienna Rothschild. Explicit photos. Declarations of love. Plans for a future together. And the worst part, their conversations about me. "I'm so tired of pretending with her," David had written. "She's like this weight around my neck. I know I chose her, but I didn't understand how exhausting it would be to constantly manage her inadequacies." Sienna's response, "Poor baby. You deserve so much better than some charity case you tried to save. When are you going to leave her?" David, "Soon. I just need to make sure the financial situation is handled properly. She's not getting half of my money. I've been moving assets around. By the time I file for divorce, it'll look like I have maybe 20 million. She'll get half of that, maybe 10 million, and think she won the lottery. Meanwhile, I'll have 180 million in offshore accounts she'll never find." I sat on the bathroom floor, reading those messages while my husband showered 10 feet away, and something inside me broke. Not just my heart, although that shattered into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. But something else broke too. The part of me that had been trying so hard to be what David wanted, to be small enough and quiet enough and simple enough to deserve his love. That part of me died. And in its place, something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous was born. I could have confronted him that night. I could have screamed and cried and demanded explanations. I could have filed for divorce immediately and tried to get whatever I could in the settlement. But I didn't do any of those things, because I realized something important as I sat on that bathroom floor. David thought I was stupid. He thought I was a naive little former teacher who didn't understand business or money or strategy. He thought I was manageable. And that assumption, that spectacular underestimation of who I really was, would be his downfall. You see, David never asked about my background. Not really. He knew I taught elementary school and that my father had died when I was 23. But he never asked what my father did, never asked about my education beyond my teaching certification, never asked about the life I had before I met him. He saw elementary school teacher and assumed that was the limit of my capabilities. He never thought to dig deeper. If he had, he would have discovered some very interesting things. Things that were about to destroy him. My father was Antonio Castellano. David had heard that name when I mentioned it on our third date. "Your father was Antonio Castellano?" he had asked, and I had nodded, pleased that he knew the name. "That's sweet that you're proud of your immigrant father's small business," David had said, smiling indulgently. Then he had changed the subject and never brought it up again. He assumed, because of my modest lifestyle and my teaching job, that my father must have owned a bodega or a dry cleaning business, something small and ethnic and insignificant. He never asked for details. He never Googled the name. He never did any research at all, because I wasn't important enough to be curious about. But Antonio Castellano wasn't a small business owner. Antonio Castellano was the founder and CEO of Castellano Industries, a manufacturing and distribution empire that he had built from nothing over 40 years. He had started with one small factory and turned it into a company worth billions. My father was brilliant, ruthless in business, and fiercely protective of his family. When he died of a heart attack when I was 23, he left everything in a trust. A trust that would be released to me, his only child, on my 33rd birthday. That birthday was tomorrow. The trust was worth $1.2 billion. David had married a billionaire and never even knew it. Because he never asked. Because he never cared enough to learn about my life before him. Because he assumed that a woman who taught elementary school couldn't possibly be worth knowing about in depth. That assumption was going to cost him everything. After I discovered the affair, after I realized David was planning to divorce me while hiding his assets, I made a decision. I would let him think his plan was working. I would continue being the quiet, simple, manageable wife he thought I was. And while he was busy congratulating himself on his brilliant strategy, I would be building a case against him that would destroy him completely. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I needed someone who understood David, who had survived him before, who had resources and connections and a burning desire to see him face consequences for his actions. I needed Catherine. I called David's ex-wife on a Tuesday afternoon, 18 months before the dinner at the Rothschild estate. She answered on the second ring. "Maya, is everything okay?" I took a deep breath. "Catherine, I need your help. You were right about him. You were right about everything." There was a long pause. Then Catherine said, "Tell me everything." We met the next day at a coffee shop across town, somewhere David would never go. I told her about the affair, about the hidden assets, about David's plan to divorce me with nothing. I told her about the messages, about how he talked about me, about how he had been systematically tearing me down for years. Catherine listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I hoped he had changed with you. I really did." Then her expression hardened. "But since he hasn't, let's destroy him." Catherine had been through this before. She knew David's tactics, his weaknesses, his patterns. More importantly, she had the resources to help me. She introduced me to her lawyers, her forensic accountants, her private investigators. People who specialized in uncovering hidden assets, documenting fraud, building ironclad cases. "We're going to need time," she told me. 18 months, maybe 2 years. Can you pretend that long? Can you keep being the wife he thinks you are while we build this case? I thought about all the times David had made me feel small. All the criticisms, all the corrections, all the ways he had tried to reshape me into something more convenient for him. All the times he had chosen his own comfort over my dignity. I looked at Catherine and said, "I can pretend as long as it takes." And that's exactly what I did. For 18 months, I played the role of the obedient, slightly stupid wife. I let David criticize my clothes and I changed them. I let him dismiss my opinions and I stayed quiet. I let him come home smelling like Sienna's perfume and I pretended not to notice. All while Catherine's team and I were systematically documenting every hidden account, every fraudulent transaction, every asset David thought he had successfully concealed. But the financial fraud was only part of the case we were building. We also needed to expose the affair in a way that would be devastating, undeniable, and public enough that David couldn't spin it in his favor. That's where Sienna came in. David's mistress was arrogant, sloppy, and addicted to social media. She posted constantly about her luxury lifestyle, often including details and locations that made it easy to track where she was and when. My private investigator, a former police detective named Janet Rodriguez, followed Sienna for months. Every hotel she and David checked into together. Every restaurant where they had intimate dinners. Every vacation they took while David told me he was traveling for business. Janet documented everything. But the real breakthrough came 6 months ago when we managed to install monitoring software on David's home computer. It was completely legal since the computer was jointly owned marital property. The software captured everything. Every email, every message, every document David created or viewed, including his communications with his lawyers about his divorce strategy, including his detailed notes about which assets he had hidden and where, including his conversations with Sienna about their future together and how they would handle the Maya problem. The recordings we got were devastating. David and Sienna discussing me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome. David explaining his financial fraud strategy to Sienna in detail. Sienna coaching David on how to claim I was an unfit wife to justify the divorce. One recording in particular was exactly what we needed. It was from 3 weeks before the Rothschild dinner. David and Sienna were on a video call, and David's computer had captured every word. "The sooner we can get this over with, the better," Sienna had said. "I'm tired of pretending to be patient while you figure out how to get rid of your baggage." David had replied weakly, "The kids aren't baggage," referring to Marcus. "They're not your kids, remember?" Sienna had said, "That's the story we're going with. Once you establish that, you won't have to pay child support and we can move on with our lives." David had actually laughed at that. But the recording continued, and this is where it became truly damning. "What if the tests show they are mine?" David had asked, referring to some crazy plan to claim Marcus wasn't his biological son to avoid parental obligations. Sienna's response was calculated and cold. Then we go to plan B. You fight for custody, claim Catherine is an unfit mother, and we get him for half the time. Either way, you minimize your financial obligations. They were planning to use Marcus, David's own son, as a pawn in their financial games. When Catherine heard that recording, her face went white with rage. We're going to destroy him, she said quietly. Completely and utterly destroy him. I nodded. That's the plan. The final piece we needed was someone on the inside of David's business world. Someone with the power and motivation to help us execute the takedown. That person was Richard Chun, managing partner at Chun Capital and one of David's biggest business rivals. Richard and David had been competing for years, and Richard had always suspected David of operating unethically. When Catherine introduced us and I showed him the evidence of David's financial fraud, Richard's eyes lit up. This is securities fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, he said, flipping through the documents. This could put him in prison. I nodded. That's what I'm hoping for. Richard leaned back in his chair and looked at me with new respect. Mrs. Bennet, you're not what I expected. I smiled. People rarely expect anything from me. It's become an advantage. Richard laughed at that, a genuine sound of appreciation. I can help you, but I want something in return. I knew what he was going to ask for before he said it. You want Bennett Technologies. He nodded. David's company is built on brilliant innovations, but it's being run by a fraudulent criminal. Under new management, ethical management, it could be worth twice what it is now. If you're planning to destroy David anyway, let me help. And when the dust settles, let me acquire the company. We negotiated for 3 hours. The end result was a complex arrangement that would benefit everyone except David. I would use my inheritance money to purchase David's outstanding debts. Once I owned enough of his debt, I could call it due, forcing the company into a position where it would have to be sold or restructured. Richard would be waiting to acquire it, but only after we had exposed all of David's fraud. The SEC would get involved, freeze David's assets, and launch an investigation. By the time everything was done, David would have nothing left. No money, no company, no reputation. Just the consequences of his own choices. The final variable was Marcus. David's 16-year-old son had been watching his father's treatment of me for years, and he was disgusted by it. Marcus had lived through David's divorce from Catherine. He had seen his father move on quickly, marry me within a year, and then begin treating me exactly the same way he had treated Catherine. Marcus was a smart kid, perceptive and mature beyond his years. 6 months ago, he had come to me privately. I know about Dad and Sienna, he had said. I've known for a while, and I know he's planning to leave you with nothing. I want to help. I had tried to protect him, tried to tell him he didn't need to be involved. But Marcus was adamant. You've been more of a parent to me than he has, Marcus had said. You actually care about me as a person, not as a reflection of his success. You come to my robotics competitions. You help me with my homework. You ask me about my life. Dad only pays attention to me when his friends are watching. So Marcus became part of the plan too. He started secretly recording his father's phone calls. He documented every time David missed a scheduled visit. He kept detailed notes of every broken promise, every dismissive comment, every moment when David chose his own convenience over his son's well-being. And when the time came, Marcus prepared a legal petition for emancipation, naming me as his chosen guardian instead of either of his biological parents. Everything was ready, every piece of evidence gathered, every ally in position, every legal document prepared. All we needed was the right moment, the right stage, the right audience to expose David's fraud and betrayal in a way that would be impossible for him to deny or spin. That moment would be the dinner at the Rothschild estate. Harrison Rothschild, Sienna's father, was one of the most powerful men in the city. He was old money, connected to everyone who mattered, and he commanded respect in every room he entered. He was also someone who valued integrity above all else. When Catherine and I approached him with our evidence of David's fraud and his daughter's complicity in it, Harrison was horrified. "I raised Sienna better than this," he had said, looking at the recordings of her coaching David through his financial fraud scheme. "Or at least I thought I did." Harrison made a decision then. He would host a dinner, invite everyone important in David's business and social world, and give us the platform to expose everything. "I won't protect my daughter from the consequences of her choices," he told us. "If she's participated in fraud, she'll face the same judgment as your husband. But I want to handle this publicly. I want everyone to see what happens when you operate without integrity." I agreed immediately. A public exposure was exactly what I wanted. David had spent 5 years making me feel small in front of other people. Now I would make him feel the full weight of his choices in front of everyone who mattered to him. So that's how we arrived at tonight. The dinner at the Rothschild estate. The event where David thought Harrison would be announcing Sienna's engagement to him, once his divorce from me was finalized. The evening where David thought he would be celebrating his brilliant escape from his burden of a wife. Instead, it would be the night when everything he had built on lies would come crashing down around him. As I walked into that estate on David's arm, wearing my modest $350 dress, looking exactly like the simple, manageable wife he thought I was, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. The game was over. David just didn't know it yet. The dinner party was already in full swing when we arrived. The massive ballroom was filled with 100 guests, all of them wealthy, powerful, influential. Crystal chandeliers hung from 30-foot ceilings. A string quartet played softly in one corner. Waiters in white gloves circulated with champagne that probably cost $1,000 a bottle. The women dripped with diamonds and wore gowns that cost more than cars. The men wore custom suits and discussed business deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This was David's world, the world he had been so desperate to keep me from contaminating with my humble background. Sienna greeted us at the entrance. She was 28 years old, beautiful in that polished way that came from a lifetime of professional stylists and expensive treatments. Her custom gown probably cost $50,000. Her diamond jewelry was family heirlooms worth millions. She smiled at David with genuine warmth, kissing him on both cheeks and letting her hands linger on his arms just a moment too long. Then she turned to me, and her expression shifted to barely concealed disdain. "Oh, Maya, how sweet. You came," she said, her tone suggesting she wished I hadn't. I smiled politely, playing my role perfectly. "Thank you for having us, Sienna. Your home is beautiful." She didn't even acknowledge the compliment, just turned her attention back to David. But then something unexpected happened. Harrison Rothschild, Sienna's father and our host, approached our group. He was 68 years old, distinguished, with the kind of presence that made people unconsciously straighten their posture when he entered a room. When he saw me, his expression shifted. Not to the dismissive politeness I usually received from David's associates, but to something that looked almost like respect. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, extending his hand, "I'm very glad you could make it this evening." The emphasis on "very glad" was subtle but unmistakable. David looked confused. Harrison had never paid particular attention to me before. Sienna's smile faltered slightly, her eyes darting between her father and me with obvious confusion. Over the next hour, I experienced something I had never felt at one of David's social events. People approached me. Not David, but me specifically. Richard Chun, the investor who was helping with our plan, shook my hand warmly. "Mrs. Bennett, I've been hoping to speak with you. I think you and I have some very interesting business to discuss." David immediately tried to intervene. "Maya doesn't really understand our industry, Richard. Perhaps we should talk, and I can relay any relevant information to her." But Richard ignored him completely. "Actually, David, I specifically want to speak with Mrs. Bennett. I think you'd be surprised by what she understands." The look on David's face was priceless. Confusion mixed with irritation that someone was treating his wife as an independent person worthy of direct communication. More people approached. Margaret Ashford, an old money socialite known for her sharp tongue and sharper judgment, studied me with new interest. "You're the teacher, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. Former teacher. I've moved into other ventures recently. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What kind of ventures? I smiled. I'll let tonight's announcements speak for themselves. Margaret looked intrigued rather than dismissive, which was a first. Even Elena Volkov, a Russian heiress known for her brutal assessment of people, approached me specifically. You're not what I expected, she said, her accent thick but her English perfect. I met her gaze directly. People rarely expect anything from me. It's become quite an advantage. Elena laughed, a sharp bark of amusement. I like you. We should have lunch sometime. David was growing increasingly irritated. He kept trying to pull me away from conversations, kept trying to minimize my interactions with his business associates. Stop trying to insert yourself into conversations above your understanding, he hissed at one point when we had a moment alone. I just smiled at him. Of course, darling. Whatever you think is best. But I could see the confusion in his eyes. Something was happening that he didn't understand, and it was making him nervous. People were treating me differently, with respect, with interest, like I mattered, and David couldn't figure out why. Then came the announcement that dinner was ready. We moved into the formal dining room, and that's when David's confusion turned to genuine alarm. The seating chart was displayed on an elegant board near the entrance. These kinds of dinners were carefully choreographed. Where you sat indicated your importance, your relationship to the host, your status in the social hierarchy. David found his name quickly, about 10 seats down from the head of the table. A respectable position, but not particularly notable. Then he found my name. I was seated at Harrison Rothschild's right hand, the position of highest honor. David stared at the seating chart like it was written in a foreign language. This has to be a mistake, he said to a nearby staff member. My wife can't be seated there. I should be next to Harrison, not her. The staff member, clearly briefed on the situation, responded politely but firmly. I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Rothschild was very specific about the seating arrangements. Mrs. Bennet is to be seated at his right hand. Across the table from me, directly in my line of sight, was Sienna. The placement was deliberate, I knew. Harrison wanted his daughter to have a front row seat to what was about to happen. David tried to switch the place cards, but was stopped again. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not irritation, but something approaching fear. For the first time in our 5-year marriage, David was looking at me and realizing he didn't understand what was happening. That he wasn't in control. That something was very, very wrong with his perfect plan. I met his gaze calmly and smiled. Just a small smile, but there was nothing kind in it. Then I took my seat at Harrison's right hand and waited for the next act of this carefully orchestrated evening to begin. The final pieces fell into place quickly after that. Marcus arrived, David's 16-year-old son, walking into the dining room with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was doing the right thing. David stood up immediately. Marcus, what are you doing here? Marcus didn't even look at his father. He walked directly to me, hugged me, and said loud enough for people nearby to hear, Hey Mom, you look amazing. The use of Mom was deliberate. Marcus had been calling me that privately for years, but never in front of David. David's face went red. Marcus, I asked you a question. What are you doing here? Before Marcus could answer, Harrison spoke up. I invited him, David. Your son should be here for this evening's announcements. David's voice took on an edge of panic. What announcements? I thought tonight was about... I thought Sienna and I... He trailed off, realizing he had almost admitted to the affair in public. Sienna looked equally confused and increasingly nervous. Then Catherine walked in. David's first wife, elegant and composed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had already survived David Bennet and come out stronger. When David saw her, he went pale. Catherine, why are you here? She smiled at him, and it was not a kind smile. Harrison invited me too. Wouldn't miss this for the world. David looked around the room wildly, trying to understand what was happening. Then his eyes landed on me, seated at the position of highest honor, calm and composed while his world started to tilt on its axis. Our eyes met across the dining room, and I saw the moment when real fear set in. When he realized that something was terribly wrong. When he understood that he had made some catastrophic miscalculation. Harrison Rothschild stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room fell silent immediately, 100 of the most powerful people in the city turning their attention to our host. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. We have some very important announcements to make. But first, I'd like to introduce someone many of you may have underestimated. He gestured to me, Mrs. Maya Bennett, though some of you may know her better by her maiden name, Maya Castellano. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Multiple guests gasped audibly. Richard Chin began smiling. Elena Volkov laughed with delight. Margaret Ashford dropped her champagne glass, the crystal shattering on the marble floor. And David looked like he had been punched in the stomach. Sienna leaned forward, her face confused and angry. "Who the fuck is Maya Castellano?" she hissed, apparently unaware that everyone could hear her. Harrison's expression hardened at his daughter's language, but he continued. Maya Castellano is the daughter of Antonio Castellano, founder and CEO of Castellano Industries. Another wave of gasps and whispers. Antonio Castellano was a legend in business circles. A self-made billionaire who had built an empire from nothing. Everyone in this room knew that name, knew that company. Harrison continued. When Antonio died 10 years ago, he left his entire estate in a trust, to be released to his daughter on her 33rd birthday. He paused for effect. That birthday is tomorrow. The trust is worth $1.2 billion. The room exploded. Conversations erupted at every table. People were staring at me with new eyes, recalculating everything they thought they knew. And David, poor David, looked like he might actually pass out. I stood slowly, aware that every eye in the room was on me now. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, my voice steady and clear. I had been speaking softly, deferentially, for 5 years. But that wasn't my real voice. My real voice had confidence, authority, strength. The voice of Antonio Castellano's daughter. Many of you may be surprised by this revelation. My husband certainly looked surprised. I glanced at David, who was gripping the edge of the table like he might collapse without its support. But the truth is, I told David about my father on our 3rd date. I told him my father was Antonio Castellano. I told him I would inherit his company. I let that information settle for a moment before continuing. David's response was to laugh and say, "That's sweet that you're proud of your immigrant father's small business." He assumed my father owned a bodega or a dry cleaning service. He never asked for details. He never looked into my background. He never cared enough to learn who I actually was. The room was dead silent now. Everyone was hanging on every word. You see, David saw that I was a teacher. He saw that I lived modestly. He saw that I came from a humble neighborhood. And he assumed that was all there was to me. That I couldn't possibly be worth knowing more deeply. David tried to speak. "Maya, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain?" I looked at him with something approaching pity. "I did tell you, David. You just weren't listening. You never listened. Not about my father, not about my education, not about anything that mattered to me. Because I wasn't important enough for you to pay attention to." Catherine stood up then, joining me at the head of the table. When Maya called me 18 months ago and told me what David was doing to her, the affair, the financial abuse, the systematic degradation, I wasn't surprised. He had done exactly the same thing to me. But I was impressed by what Maya wanted to do about it. Harrison nodded. Mrs. Bennett approached me 3 months ago with extensive documentation of financial fraud at Bennett Technologies. Evidence of embezzlement, securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, along with evidence of a conspiracy to hide marital assets and commit fraud in anticipation of a divorce. Richard Chen stood up now too. As of this morning, the SEC has frozen all of David's assets pending investigation. I have personally reviewed the evidence Mrs. Bennett provided, And I can confirm that David has been systematically stealing from his own company and defrauding his shareholders for over 2 years. The criminal charges will be substantial. David was shaking his head, looking around the room desperately for support, for someone who would defend him. But every face showed either shock, disgust, or satisfaction at watching a corrupt man face consequences. Then I pulled out my tablet, the same one that contained months of documentation. But the financial fraud is only part of the story, I said. I pressed play on the recording. David's voice filled the room, unmistakable and clear. Once I divorce Maya, we can finally be together properly. She'll get nothing. I've made sure of that. Then Sienna's voice, equally clear. What about the prenup? David's recorded voice continued. There is no prenup, but she doesn't know I've been moving money for years. By the time the divorce is final, it'll look like I have 20 million. She'll get half of that, maybe 10 million. Sienna's laugh echoed through the dining room. And the rest? David on the recording. 180 million in offshore accounts she'll never find. The recording continued. Sienna's voice dripping with contempt. Poor, stupid Maya. Does she really think you ever loved her? The room was absolutely silent except for the recording. When it ended, the silence continued for a long moment. Then Harrison turned to his daughter. His face was carved from stone, showing no emotion, but his voice was ice cold. Sienna, you knew about the fraud. You participated in planning it. You helped him conspire to destroy his wife. Sienna was crying now, mascara running down her face. Daddy, I didn't know, I thought I just wanted. Harrison held up his hand, silencing her. You're cut off. Effective immediately. Trust fund, credit cards, apartment, all of it. Gone. Sienna's face went white. Daddy, no, please. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. But Harrison had already turned away from her. Security guards appeared from the sides of the room, the same security I had hired weeks ago and positioned strategically throughout the estate. Harrison looked at them and nodded. They moved toward David. You need to leave now, Mr. Bennett. One of them said quietly but firmly. David looked around wildly, like he was searching for an escape route. Then he fell to his knees in front of me. Right there in front of 100 of the most powerful people in the city. My husband dropped to his knees and begged. Maya, please. I'm sorry. I made mistakes. But we can fix this. I love you. We can work this out. I looked down at him, this man who had spent 5 years making me feel worthless, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pain, not even satisfaction. Just a cold, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. You don't love me, David. You never did. You loved what you thought I was. Someone you could control. Someone who would make you feel powerful by being small and grateful and manageable. I crouched down so I was at his eye level. But I was never what you thought I was. I was always Antonio Castellano's daughter. I was always worth more than you could dream of being. You just never bothered to look. David tried to grab my hands, but I pulled away. Every time you told me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't good enough for your world, I was worth over $1 billion. I had an MBA from Wharton. I came from a family that built an empire. And you had built a company on fraud and theft. I stood up. You told me not to embarrass you tonight, David. I kept my promise. I didn't embarrass you. You embarrassed yourself. Marcus stepped forward then, holding a folder of legal documents. He handed them to his father. These are my emancipation papers, Marcus said, his young voice steady and clear. I'm petitioning to be released from both your custody and Mom's. And I'm naming Maya as my chosen guardian. David looked at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Marcus, no. Son, please. She's been poisoning you against me. Marcus shook his head. She didn't have to poison me against you, Dad. I watched you do that yourself. Every time you belittled her at dinner. Every time you made her feel small. Every time you chose Sienna over your actual family. He stepped closer to me, and I put my arm around his shoulders. Maya has been more of a parent to me than you ever were. She actually cares about me as a person, not just as a reflection of your success. So yes, I choose her. The security guards moved closer to David. "Sir, you need to leave now." David looked around the room one more time, seeing nothing but disgust and contempt on every face. The man who had walked into this party expecting to celebrate his brilliant escape from his burdensome wife was being escorted out in disgrace, exposed as a fraud and a thief in front of everyone who mattered in his world. As the guards led him toward the door, David turned back one last time. Our eyes met across the dining room. "How did you do this?" he asked, his voice broken. "How did you?" I smiled then, finally. "I learned from the best, David. You taught me that people will always underestimate the quiet ones. Thank you for that lesson. It was invaluable." And then he was gone, escorted out of the Rothschild estate, out of his position of power, out of the life he had built on lies and fraud. The security guards closed the doors behind him, and the room remained silent for a long moment. Then Harrison raised his glass. "To Maya Bennett, may we all learn the lesson her husband failed to learn. Never underestimate someone just because they choose to be kind." The room erupted in applause. 100 of the most powerful people in the city, people who had dismissed me, ignored me, treated me like furniture for 5 years, were now standing and applauding. For me, Margaret Ashford approached, her expression chagrined. "Mrs. Bennett, I owe you an apology. I underestimated you terribly." I accepted her hand. "Most people do. I've learned to use it as an advantage." Richard Chun was smiling broadly. "Mrs. Bennett, I believe we have business to discuss. Bennett Technologies needs new management, and I think we both know it should be ethical management this time." I nodded. "Let's schedule something for next week. I have a company to inherit first." Elena Volkov kissed me on both cheeks. "You are magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. That was the most beautiful revenge I have ever witnessed." Over the next hour, I received more business cards, more investment opportunities, more sincere apologies than I could count. These people had seen me as nothing for years. Now they saw me as I actually was, and they wanted to be associated with that power. But the best moment of the night came when Marcus hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for everything." I held him close, this boy who wasn't mine biologically but was absolutely mine in every way that mattered. "We're going to be okay," I told him. "We're going to be more than okay." Catherine joined us, and the 3 of us stood together, a strange little family built from the wreckage of David's betrayals. "Your father would be proud," Catherine said to me quietly. "What you did tonight, the strength it took to plan this, to wait this long, to execute it perfectly. Antonio raised a warrior." I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time that evening. "I just wanted justice," I said. "You got it," Catherine replied. "You got it in the most spectacular way possible." As the party continued around us, as people celebrated and gossiped and marveled at the evening's revelations, I slipped outside onto one of the estate's many terraces. The city spread out below me, lights twinkling in the darkness. I thought about the past 5 years, about the woman I had been when I met David, about the woman I had become through his systematic attempts to diminish me. And I realized something. David hadn't made me weak. His abuse, his betrayal, his cruelty, none of it had broken me. Instead, it had revealed strength I didn't know I had. I thought about my father, Antonio Castellano, who had built an empire from nothing, who had taught me that being underestimated was a gift, not a curse, who had told me when I was young that the most dangerous people in any room were the ones everyone overlooked. He had set up the trust knowing I would need time to find myself, to become strong enough to handle the responsibility of his legacy. And he had been right. At 23, when he died, I wasn't ready. But at almost 33, after surviving David Bennett, after learning to fight back, after discovering the steel in my own spine, I was more than ready. My phone buzzed. A text message from my lawyer. "David's assets have been frozen. The SEC investigation is officially underway. Criminal charges will likely be filed within the week." You did it. I looked at that message and felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was over. The fear, the pretending, the constant vigilance, all of it was finally over. David couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't hurt anyone anymore. His company would be restructured under ethical management. His fraud would be punished. His victims would get justice. And I would move forward into the life I was always meant to live. The life of Antonio Castellano's daughter. The life of a woman who had survived betrayal and come out stronger. The life of someone who would never again let anyone make her feel small. Tomorrow, I would officially inherit my father's company. I would become the CEO of Castellano Industries. I would take the empire my father built and make it even greater. I would use the resources at my disposal to help other women who had been where I was, trapped in marriages with men who saw them as possessions rather than partners. I would fund legal services, financial counseling, and job training for women escaping abuse. I would make sure that no woman had to stay because she couldn't afford to leave. But tonight, standing on that terrace looking out at the city, I allowed myself just to feel proud. Proud of what I had accomplished. Proud of how I had fought back. Proud of the fact that I had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and turned it into the foundation of something better. David had warned me not to embarrass him at this dinner, and I had kept that promise. I hadn't embarrassed him. The room hadn't been waiting for him at all. They had been waiting for me. To meet the woman David had been hiding. To see the billionaire he had married without even knowing it. To witness the moment when the underestimated wife revealed herself to be the most powerful person in the room. My husband had spent 5 years trying to make me small. Tonight, I had shown him and everyone else exactly how big I actually was. And tomorrow, I would wake up as one of the wealthiest women in the country, ready to build a future on my own terms. A future where kindness wasn't weakness, where being underestimated was a strategic advantage, where the quiet ones were the most dangerous. David Bennett had made the mistake of thinking that gentle meant manageable. He learned far too late that he was wrong. And now the whole world knew it too. I smiled into the darkness, feeling lighter and freer than I had in years. The game was over and I had won. Not just the money or the company or the satisfaction of seeing David face consequences. I had won something far more valuable. I had won myself back. The woman David had tried to erase was gone, but someone better had taken her place. Someone stronger, smarter, more dangerous. Someone who would never again let anyone define her worth. Someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. That woman was me, and tomorrow the world would know it too.